This is Colonel Conrad Reynolds, and this episode of the Kernel of Truth is probably the most important one that I'll do this season. This information should make all of those who defend the current voting system change their minds. Dr. Dr Appel from Princeton University, a leading computer expert, breaks down why the voting computers should not be used in our election systems. Because this information is so vital, we have removed all of our ads, and this video is solely sponsored by avii.org. And please do me a favor, like and share this video to help others discover the truth. This episode will be posted on www.forttruth.com. That's www.forttruth.com. And thank you for tuning in. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show. I'm Colonel Conrad Reynolds, and you're on the Kernel of Truth. And today we have a very special guest. I just want to brag on him a little bit, because this guy is incredible. Dr. Dr Appel. He is at the Eugene Higgins Professor for Computer Science in Princeton University, where he serves as department chair from 2009 to 2015. His PhD is from Carnegie Mellon University. He works on methods and tools for verifying the correctness of software, on cybersecurity, and on technology policy, especially voting system security. He has published over 140 scientific articles and books and about 90 blog articles on freedomtotinker.com, explaining voting system technology and security issues to the public. Professor Appel co-authored the National Academy of Science 2018 study, Securing the Vote, Protecting American Democracy. Dr. Appel, welcome to our program.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, it is an honor and a privilege. I have done a little research on you, look back at some of your testimony before Congress and some of the papers you've written on this freedomtotinker.com. Very impressed. And you're the kind of guy we need. We need to have your expertise. We need to have a real expert talking to the people of America. I know you've been out there. You've been trying to explain to people how these machines work, how the election process could be better. And I don't know that you're getting as much coverage, or any other experts are getting the coverage they really deserve in this area. Do you?
You know, the experts get more coverage in even-numbered years. And then, you know, when it's between elections, the media doesn't pay so much attention.
Yes, that's true. That's true. But I just think that if anybody takes the time, just a few minutes to read through some of the articles that y'all have written and the explanations that you've given about how these machines work, what the vulnerabilities are, everybody would take a second look at it and stop and pause and say, hey, are we doing this right? There are many states, to include our own right here in Arkansas. I don't think they've reached out to anybody and talked to any security expert. I think South Carolina did. They reached out to you guys, right?
South Carolina. You know, I talked to people in a lot of states.
Yeah.
About one thing or another. And it's true that in many states, even including my own state in New Jersey, election officials don't always think about the security implications of just adopting computers here and there to replace the parts of their traditional methods. There's definitely a place for computers in running elections, but we have to think about which parts of the system we can trust and which parts we should take another look at.
Right. Well, in Arkansas, just to give you an example, same thing with South Carolina. They went to full the ballot marking devices for everybody. Instead of them just being for the handicap or the disabled, they've gone to for everybody. And of course, those were developed initially, from my understanding, is for the handicap. But they've used them now for everyone. Do you see a problem with that?
I do see a problem with that. You know, the most reliable way for us to vote and count our votes is to mark paper ballots with a pen. Then you can count those paper ballots with optical scan machines, but you have always the ability to recount them or audit the paper by having human beings in teams of 2 or more, look at
Right.
that paper and see what's marked on it. And when we start to use touch screens to record our votes and mark our ballots, then we have to worry about whether the votes marked on our ballots by the computers are the ones that we actually indicated. Because if the votes that get marked on the paper ballots aren't the ones the voter intended, then no recount can correct that. Once it's on the paper ballot, the recount counts what's on the paper ballot. And there's the vulnerability with ballot marking devices, such as the ones that, you've adopted in Arkansas, that were adopted in Georgia, in parts of Pennsylvania, in Los Angeles. Arkansas is not the only place that has adopted these. There's about half a dozen states and parts of a few others that are using ballot marking devices for all voters. And I think it's a bad idea.
I think that you're right, but you're the expert. I'm just listening to you, and I've got a question, because when I bring this up to people and I kind of say almost exactly what you just said, the very first thing they tell me is, hold on a second, Colonel. Let me school you on this. We do an LNA test. We do a logic and accuracy test. We ensure that these machines are working properly prior to the election. In fact, we even do a public demonstration by law, and we show, and nobody comes, they say, but they said we show that we run a stack of these ballots through the machine, and they are 100% accurate every time. There's no way they can possibly be manipulated because they're not connected to the internet. You simply don't know what you're talking about. What do you say to people like that?
Well, a logic and accuracy test is useful for catching accidental misconfiguration, but it's not useful for catching malware, hacks in the voting machine that might be deliberately cheating. So let me talk about old-fashioned voting machines and modern voting machines.
Okay.
More than 100 years ago, people invented mechanical lever action voting machines where you walk into a booth and there's lots of little odometers recording votes behind the screen. And those were not computers. They weren't really programmable. The mechanism worked the same way today as it would tomorrow. And if you did a logic and accuracy test before the election to make sure that the mechanism was all working, then very likely it would work the same way during the election.
Right.
But that was 100 years ago, or 60 years ago, or 40 years ago. This is the 21st century, and now we have computers. And the essential thing about a computer is that you can change the program. You can install new software in it. Every one of us that has a computer or a phone, we know that new software is being installed every month, every week. We get our software updates, we install our apps, we change out our apps. The whole thing about a computer is you don't know what software is in it today. Now, what that means is a determined hacker, the adversary of election integrity, can devise a computer program that behaves one way on a Monday when they're running the logic and accuracy test, and behaves different way on a Tuesday of the actual election. The computer program knows what the date is. Your phone, your computer knows the date, and it's not at all hard to write a program that cheats only on election day. In fact, there was a court case in New Jersey 15 years ago where we demonstrated to the court by writing a little computer program like that would only cheat, on election day. And in a protected, court-ordered forensic environment, we actually installed that on the voting machine because, it's a felony to do it out there in the wild, and demonstrated this. And I'm not the only one to demonstrate this. It's just a basic fact of computer science that it's not hard to write a computer program that behaves this way one day and that way another day. So now let's come back to logic and accuracy tests and what they're good for and what they're not good for.
Okay.
If the voting administrators have accidentally misconfigured a ballot so that it's, reading marks from the wrong place in the page, and people are human, people make mistakes, that's okay, then the logic and accuracy test is a great way to catch that kind of thing because you'll mark the ballots a certain way. You'll run them through the voting machine and see what the totals come out to, and it won't be right from your test deck. That's fine. What they can't do is detect whether the voting machine is going to cheat on a Tuesday when you test it on a Monday, if the cheating has been programmed deliberately into it. Now, we don't believe that these computers are routinely programmed to cheat, right? We just know that it's possible to do that, and we want to make sure that our elections are trustworthy, even in light of reprogrammable computers. And for that, the logic and accuracy, the LNA tests are not useful.
I agree, and of course I didn't use exactly your example, but I've told people, I said, you know, do you have a computer at home, and have you ever had to change the date and time for daylight savings time ever? And of course, the answer is no. And say, well, you know, how does it know? Of course, it knows when election day is. And so we don't know. Again, these are hypotheticals. We don't know if the machines cheat, but it would be very easy, for example, and correct me if I'm wrong, for example, someone checks in to the e-poll book, and they, whoever holds that information, in our case, it's a company called ES&S, and they have a database for all those names, and that's being preloaded into these little laptop computers for the e-poll book. But that particular program or that e-poll book knows that I'm there. It knows my age. It knows how old I am. It knows my voter history. And then a piece of paper comes out of that machine that I'm going with a barcode on it that I'm going to be sticking to the next machine, which is a touchscreen express vote. That barcode, they say, only brings up the ballot style. But I asked them, how do you know that? What else is it telling that machine to do? It, you know, from a national security perspective, and I look at this and I go, I know that barcodes don't always mean exactly what, there's more to it, and I can't read it. I don't read barcode.
Right. I don't read barcodes either. You know, we're human. The barcodes are not intended for us to read.
No, it's only for the machines. And what do you think about the use of barcodes?
Well, before we talk about barcodes,
okay,
and before we talk about touchscreen ballot marking devices, let's just talk about, you know, the more basic voting process that's used in most states. It's probably used in Arkansas until, you know, last year. And in what way you could make that trustworthy. Mm-hmm. So voter comes in, signs in at the poll book, and is handed a paper ballot with ovals to fill in with a pen that are by the names of the candidates that they want to vote for. And they take that to some cardboard privacy booth. And it's important that they mark their ballot in the privacy booth where everybody can see that nobody can see what they're marking, that they are not selling their vote to someone, right? They're marking their ballot in private. And then they bring that ballot and they feed it into, let's say, an optical scanner at the polling place, or they put it in a ballot box at the polling place that will be run through the optical scanner at County Central. And those optical scanners are computers too, and they can be programmed to cheat. We believe that usually they're not, but we can't know for sure whether those optical scanners can be hacked. But we have a very important safeguard, which is all the paper ballots that the voter actually marked with their own, you know, with a pen, that they saw what they were marking, and that the optical scanner drops that into a sealed ballot box.
Right.
And it's important to preserve a sound chain of custody of those ballot boxes. They go into the vault at County Central, and they can be recounted by human beings that can read for themselves what marks are on those ballots. The ability to have a recount is very important, because that's our check on in case the machines were either deliberately programmed to cheat or were just misconfigured and reading the ballots wrong.
You have just outlined exactly what we're asking for here in Arkansas. Exactly. And we're getting fought tooth and nail from the establishment. Nobody wants to get rid of the machines. They basically have said, we don't have a problem in Arkansas. Bring us the evidence, is what they've said. Now we're going to take a break here in just a minute, Dr. Appel, and I'd like to come back and talk to you a little bit about the evidence, or the ability why we can't get evidence, and talk a little bit about the coding itself if you have time. But thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be right back. Okay, welcome back to the show, The Kernel of Truth, where I have a special guest, Dr. Andrew Appel. He is professor at computer science at Princeton University, one of the smartest guys in the country on election security. And we're having a short discussion on the voting process and the vulnerabilities that are present in our current system. And Dr. Appel, thank you for coming. And we were just talking at the break about the BDMs, these ballot marking devices. Can you share your thoughts on that and the vulnerabilities that you see, particularly as it pertains to voter intent?
Sure. So we were just talking about, you could mark a paper ballot by hand, fill in the ovals for the optical scanner. But in some states, they brought out these touchscreen ballot marking devices. So instead of using a pen to fill in the ovals for your ballot, you use a touchscreen and you select your candidates on the touchscreen. And when you're all done and you reviewed your selections, it prints out a paper ballot that records supposedly what you indicated on the screen. And then that ballot is what's fed through the optical scanner. And that ballot is what's preserved in case there's a recount by humans looking at actual pieces of paper. And there's a real problem with that approach. Think about what's on that paper ballot. Supposedly, it's what you marked on the touchscreen. And you get a chance to look at that paper ballot and see if it is what you marked on the touchscreen. You get that chance. Just like you get the chance to review the receipt from the ATM when you get cash. I get that chance every time I get cash from the ATM. Do I actually look at the receipt? Once in a while, right? I remember, long ago, the first time I used an ATM, I definitely looked at the receipt. But, most voters do not actually look at the paper ballot that comes out of the ballot marking device. So if candidates are marked on there, votes are marked on there that they didn't indicate on the touchscreen, they won't notice. And if they take the ballot from the ballot marking device and feed it into the optical scanner where it's counted and it's preserved for a recount, then the paper that's counted, that's preserved for a recount, has votes that they didn't vote. Now, why is that a problem? If somebody has deliberately hacked the ballot marking device to commit election fraud to get their candidate elected, and if they hack that ballot marking device to, let's say, shift 5% of the votes in the race for sheriff from one candidate to another, well, most voters won't notice. And you can alter that race in a way that will survive any possible recount. So in that case, we have no check, no security against the possibility of fraud in the computer.
Right.
And, that's the problem with ballot marking devices. When you mark a ballot with a pen, there's no computer hack that can manipulate you into marking the wrong space. Whatever space you mark, you can see what you're marking. A human being recounting your ballot can see what you marked without any computers in the way interpreting what's happening for you.
Are you familiar with the University of Michigan study? I'm sure you are, Professor Halderman. They did a study about that particular thing, and they said 93% of the people never noticed any of the changes that they intentionally did on a mock election.
Yeah. Let me tell you about two studies. That's one of them. That's a very good study. But there was a study even before that in Tennessee. So some observers went to a polling place in Tennessee where there's using a bunch of these ballot marking devices. And they stood against the wall like any election observer was allowed to do and just observed the behavior of real voters in a real polling place in a real primary election in 2018. And they found that when the voters took the ballot card from the ballot marking device and carried it over to the optical scanner, half the voters didn't look at it at all. Okay, and the other half looked at it for an average of 3.9 seconds. Now think about that. There were 18 contests in that election, 18 races. And if you review 18 races in 4 seconds, that's like a quarter of a second per vote. So these voters are not reviewing it very carefully. They're just taking a glance at it. If the machines had been cheating, we have no evidence that the machines were cheating. Probably they weren't cheating. But if the machines had been cheating, these voters wouldn't have caught it.
Right.
So that was the Tennessee study. Then the Michigan study is, you'd like to do a study where in a real polling place, the machines are deliberately cheating on one contest, and you see if voters will catch it in a real election. But that would be a felony. So let's not do that. In the Michigan study, they set up a mock election in a public library. They used real voters, but not in a real election. And they used real voting machines that they had deliberately hacked. And they asked the voters, we're testing out a new election setup. Would you like to try out? And the voters went in, they marked the ballot just the way they had in the election a month earlier. And the machines were deliberately changing their vote in one contest on that ballot, let's say the race for sheriff. And indeed, 7% of the voters, said, this is not what I marked. I have a question about this. And 93% of the voters either didn't notice or didn't say anything. Because, it's sometimes intimidating in a polling place. And you think if it's marked wrong, that was your fault or something. And, voters should speak up. They shouldn't be intimidated, but people are people. We can't change people. So that's the scientific evidence for if the machines were cheating, people really wouldn't notice. And I want to add one more thing. What about that one person who will notice? And they say, this vote on this line isn't the one I indicated on a touchscreen. What are they supposed to do? Well, they're supposed to tell the election worker that it's marked wrong. And then what's the election worker supposed to do? The election worker is supposed to say, okay, sir, we'll void that ballot for you. You can have a do-over. Now, think about what's happening there. The voter has just caught the machine cheating red-handed, but there's no evidence the machine cheated. The election worker doesn't know whether the machine cheated or the voter just misremembered. Even if you catch the machine cheating, you can't prove it. So basically, the machine can get away with cheating on 93% of the people. And on the 7% where the voter catches it, okay, they get a do-over. So you can only steal 93% of the votes you set out to steal, not 100%. That's our defense. That's completely inadequate. That's why we shouldn't be using touchscreen ballot marking devices.
I could not agree with you more. I have more questions, and we have more things that we want to talk about, particularly the Halderman report out of Georgia. I know that you can hang with us, so we're going to take a break here. I'm Colonel Conrad Reynolds with the Kernel of Truth, and we'll be back with Professor Appel in just a few minutes. We'll come back to the Kernel of Truth. I have Professor Appel, the most experienced person I know in America on voting machines, and we're privileged to have him here, and we want to pick up the conversation where we left off. One of the things we've just started on was these vote centers, Professor, and the fact that everybody wants these machines who are in the election process. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. In a traditional polling place, you have to go to the particular polling place in the elementary school gym or the church basement or whatever that's near your house. And there are only, 400 or 800 people going to vote there. They have your name on the list for that place, and you have to go to that place to vote. And then they only need one ballot style because that place is in a particular ward in a particular town. So everybody there is going to vote on the same set of candidates. Now, the idea of a vote center is for the convenience of the voter, maybe your place of work is on the other side of the county from your residence, and you're not going to be able to vote, in business hours near your home. So the idea of a vote center is that you can go to any of the vote centers in your county, and especially in early voting, you can go there in any of the early voting days before the election, and you can cast your ballot no matter which part of the county you're from. And this is a good idea. If you're going to have early voting, you can't staff every single one of those precincts for every single one of the days before the election. First of all, the elementary school needs their gym most of those days, and the church needs their basement. So the vote centers are a good idea, and we should have vote centers, but it adds a complication to the process, because when you go to the vote center, they need to be able to supply the ballot style that's appropriate for where you live. If you live in this town, you need to be able to vote for the mayor of this town. If you live over there, you need to be able to vote for, the school board in that place. So the vote center needs to be able to supply the voter with any one of many different ballot styles. And one way to do that is to have racks full of pre-printed ballots for the appropriate ballot styles for all the different towns in the county. And when you sign into the poll book at the vote center, they look up which ballot style to hand you, and they hand you that optical scan ballot to fill in with a pen. And you might think it's a little old-fashioned to have racks full of different ballot styles, and you might think it's impractical, but it's perfectly practical. And that's what they do in Colorado and in Maryland and in several other states, where they do not need fancy touchscreen technology for people to mark their ballots. That this simple expedient of pre-printing the appropriate racks full of the ballot styles that you need for the different parts of the county works just fine. And I think one of the reasons why some election officials like the ballot marking device touchscreen so much is that they don't need to handle the logistical task of pre-printing optical scan ballots for the voters to use. They don't have to have those racks full of stuff. Those racks are very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
A cart with racks on it might cost hundreds of dollars, and you need like 3 of them. So we're not talking big bucks here, but it's just the hassle that maybe the election official doesn't want to deal with of pre-printing the different styles of paper ballots. So the advantage to them is the voter arrives, and if they go to a touchscreen ballot marking device to indicate their ballot, there's no pre-printed anything. The voter indicates their candidates on the touchscreen, and then the computer prints out the paper ballot for the voter. And that's very convenient for the election official. And it would be great if we could trust the computers to never cheat. And that's something we are not able to achieve. There's, the current state of computer security is that we can't really know what software is installed in the voting machine today. So the touchscreens are there, I think, because election administrators find them convenient for themselves. And there are other solutions that work just as well, but don't require a computer to be the one marking your ballot for you.
Right.
If you want to have vote centers, you could adopt one of those solutions and still have your vote centers, still accommodate the voters in the way that voters would like to be accommodated. That's perfectly reasonable to accommodate them that way, but let them mark their ballot with a pen. Right.
Well, one of the things that I realized going to all the different countries that I've been in, particularly with Army intelligence, we would look at human nature and use that to our advantage, obviously, to protect our troops, to protect our weapon systems. So human nature is one of the things that we looked at, but also convenience. Everybody loves convenience. And so I think you're right. It's one of the driving factors here is convenience, and also the lack of accountability. I think that is something, because really, if something happened, it's a computer glitch. It's a problem that way, as opposed to being someone else wearing the full responsibility of that mistake. That's what we see. And they're easy, and they're out by 10 o'clock at night on election night. They're done, and they don't have to worry about hand counting. That's why nobody wants to do an audit here. And we will talk about audits and all that in a little bit, because I'm going to ask your opinion on what you think about post-election audits. But I think that it's important for us to know that right now, our current system is set up to where we can't, again, produce any evidence. It's very, very difficult. I think that they use, or could use potentially, could use human nature, as we just talked about with the ballot marking devices, where people do not check their ballot receipt when it comes out. It's kind of like going to Walmart. But the same thing that you talked about the ATM. When people go to Walmart,
let's
they
not call
trust
it a
what they.
receipt. Let's not call it a receipt, though. A receipt is something that you get to take home with you.
Well, that's
and
true.
It proves that you did a transaction. In America, we have the secret ballot. So you get to mark your ballot, and nobody needs to know how you voted. And so that means that, you don't have to give into pressure from your employer or whatever.
True. So it's a ballot summary card is what they call it. Yeah.
That ballot card, you deposit in the ballot box.
Right.
You don't receive it to keep. So
that's true. It's not that's right. But when it comes out of that machine, and we know that most people don't look at it. I read the study you're talking about, and from Tennessee, and they simply don't look. They trust what they saw on the screen or what they thought they saw. And so and we do the same thing when we go to Walmart and we buy something with a touch screen. We believe what we see on the computer, on the screen. We throw our credit card in, our receipt comes out, we throw it in our pocket, we never look at it again. Most
and,
people
we're not wrong to do that. It's reasonable for people to do that. The banks have, controlled their security so that their ATMs are pretty reliably giving the same amount of money that they're recording on the receipt. So it's rational for us to not look. It's just that in a different context, elections, where you don't get to take that piece of paper home with you, and it wouldn't do you any good if you did, because you want it to be in the box to be counted. In that different context, our trust in the computer could be exploited.
I understand completely. Well, Dr. Appel, we're going to take another break, and then I'm going to bring you back for our last segment, where we want to talk about audits, what you think about audits and post-election audits, and also the Halderman report out of Georgia. Thank you very much. This is a Kernel of Truth. We'll be right back. Hey, this is Colonel Conrad Reynolds, and welcome back to the Kernel of Truth, where I have a special guest, Dr. Andrew Appel. Dr. Appel, we have covered a lot of ground over the last few segments. In this one, I want to talk about the audit process and the importance of the post-election audit. And I'd like to get your thoughts on that and what you think are what's appropriate and what works. Sure. I'll give it to you.
Right. So we can employ the best cybersecurity methods we can. That's a good idea, but we can still never quite trust what software is installed in the voting machine when it's counting the votes. So our important safeguard is that we mark our votes on paper ballots. We count them by machine. Those machines are very accurate when they're not hacked, and we can make use of that accuracy. But then our important safeguard is that we have the paper ballots in the ballot box. The machine counts them and drops them into the ballot box, that we can recount by hand or do a random audit to make sure that the machines weren't cheating this time. And since we want to be able to trust every election, we should do that audit every time.
Primaries too.
Primaries too. And so what is that audit? Well, if you only had a small number of ballots, a few hundred, then the simplest way to audit is just to recount them by hand. I'm not a big fan of counting ballots by hand only. If you do that on election night after the poll workers have been staffing the polls for 12 hours and people are tired,
right,
and the news media are in a big rush to get the results, it's not going to work well. People are going to make mistakes. They're going to be rushed. And humans generally are not as accurate in doing this as machines. But hand counting the paper ballots is an excellent way of checking on the machines and doing that extra test. So count the ballots by machine, get your results immediately on election night, put the ballots in the vault in County Central at the elections office, and a day or two later, come in with a team and recount those ballots. And you want a team of, typically you get a team of 2 or 3 people handling the ballots and reading off the votes, and a couple of people watching them. A team of 4 or 5 people is about right, so that there's no single person you have to trust. If you don't trust the other side, well, you have your people there too in the team. And that's a tried and true method for, hundreds of years in this country. That's how we do ballot counting and recounts. Now, recounting all the ballots the next day is an excellent audit method if you only have a few hundred ballots or 1,000 ballots. If you have many, many thousands of ballots, then you could recount the whole thing, but that's labor intensive. It takes a while, it costs money, and there's a better method called the risk limiting audit. You take a random sample of the ballots, pick a ballot at random, and see if it says what the computer claimed it said.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have the right optical scan voting machine technology, it can record a data file where it states its claim about what each different ballot had marked on it. And then you can random sample just a couple of hundred ballots with human beings pulling those ballots out of the batches, inspecting them, and recording, what they think it says, and then you can compare. And this is a way to check up on the computer. And if you catch it cheating, well, there's evidence of that because it's recorded its claim. You can, the teams, the human beings can see for themselves what it said. That process is called a risk limiting audit. What does risk limiting mean? It means statistically designed to have a strong probability of catching any mistake in the outcome that the computer might make if there was a mistake, and guaranteeing that if the computer didn't make a mistake, the audit is not going to create a mistake. So it can only improve the process.
Right. Now, the risk limit audit that was invented by Professor Stark, is that correct? Philip Stark?
That's correct.
And so let me give you an example of one type of auditing where let's say that a team goes into a county and they pick out randomly 8 or 9 boxes out of 100, and they say, we're going to look at one race and in the general, just the general, and they look at one race and they open up a box and they tape from the DS200 or whatever machine does the tabulating, says there's 500 ballots in this box, 450 votes for candidate A and 50 votes for candidate B. And they hand count those, say, yep, there's 500. And yep, there's 450 for this candidate A and 50 for candidate B. And they do 8 other boxes out of 100. And they go 100% accuracy. Is that good enough?
It's not good enough. It was sort of the best we knew how to do 20 years ago, before sort of people had thought hard about this question and devised sort of methods that will make better guarantees. So because that was how people thought about random audits 20 years ago or more, that's what you find written into a lot of state laws.
Right.
And it's, there's 2 important limitations of that. First, if you only count some of the ballot boxes, then to get the same level of statistical guarantee, you got to do a lot more work. Out of 8 or 9 ballot boxes, each one has 500 ballots. That's a lot of counting to have to do. But the more important limitation is that some states say, well, you only got to pick one race to recount, to audit. And that means the machines, if they were hacked, they could get away with cheating in the other contests that you didn't audit. So it's a very weak kind of guarantee that you're getting with that old-fashioned kind of audit. And it's really inadequate.
I believe you. I believe you 100%. What would be the risk limit audit is what you would, aside from doing all of them, probably a risk limit audit would be a good thing. But what about the primaries? In other words, what is the importance in a solid red state or a solid blue state? Can you talk a little bit about the importance of auditing a primary versus the general?
You know, if we're going to have primary elections, then we should probably, let the outcome of that be that election be what the voters actually decided. And so we should run primary elections in a way that we can trust just as much as the way we run our general elections. And if you want to trust that the computers weren't cheating in a particular primary election, then you got to be able to examine the paper ballots by hand after the computers count them, just like you would in a general election, whether that's a hand recount or the statistical audit method. If you're going to have risk limiting audits, you should have them in primary elections as well as in general elections. Not to mention that in some states, the primary election is the one that really counts. In your deep blue states, then the Democratic primary election is the one that really counts. And then the winner, that's a shoe-in in the general election. And in your deep red states, the primary election in the Republican Party is the one that counts. And it matters to people. And the people's voices should be heard on that. So it's important to have your hand count recounts or election audits in the primary elections as well as in the general election.
Agreed. Agreed. In our remaining 4 minutes or so, I'd like to touch on the Halderman report out of Georgia. Now, I've got in my hands here a letter that was co-authored by you and 15 other experts. Unsealing the Halderman report would be responsible vulnerability disclosure, written May 12th, 2023. And I want to congratulate you on this because I think this had something to do, maybe I'm wrong, but with the actual release of the Halderman report, which came a month later.
Yeah.
So
let me tell you about the Halderman report.
Yeah.
There's been a lawsuit in Georgia where a good government group sued the state of Georgia saying, you can't use these ballot marking devices because we can't secure them and we can't trust that they're actually counting the vote. And so a federal judge allowed the, plaintiff's cybersecurity expert, Professor Halderman of the University of Michigan, to examine the Dominion voting machines that were being used in Georgia. And he filed his report 2 years ago to the court.
Yes, sir.
It was shared with the attorneys for the plaintiffs and the attorneys for the defendant state of Georgia, but not anyone else. It was under seal because the judge was worried that if Professor Halderman found how to hack the machines, then everybody would know how to hack the machines and the machines would be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And he found all sorts of vulnerabilities, all sorts of ways to hack the machines. These machines were needlessly insecure, just the way software is in our world these days. So, and this was disclosed to the state of Georgia and Dominion like 2 years ago. Dominion said, we can fix some of these things. And they put out a new release of their software several months ago that's available to the state of Georgia as a software upgrade. Now, I don't know for sure whether all the things really got fixed, but Dominion made a good faith effort to fix them. It would be a good idea to install the patches. When your computer or your phone says, I have a security update for the operating system, would you like to install it? I would recommend to your audience, install those things. Your operating system supplier, whether it's Microsoft or Apple or whatever, is making a good faith effort to improve the security of your computer, and you should install the updates. We have a concept in computer security called responsible vulnerability disclosure. If I find a hack that could affect, the Microsoft operating system, I'll tell Microsoft about it, but I'll also tell Microsoft, if you don't produce a fix for this within 90 days, I'm going to tell the world. And that puts pressure on Microsoft to supply a fix. And that process has been in place for 20 years now, and it works great. You know, we disclose their vulnerabilities to the software vendors. They know that we're going to embarrass them if they don't fix it. They fix it. The fixes get distributed. That's why all your listeners get their phones improved security every week, right, and their computers every month. Same thing happened here. Dominion got the disclosure. They fixed it. The state of Georgia will not install the patches. They say, oh, well, it's too inconvenient to install the patches before the election, so we're just going to run the old buggy software for the next year and a half until the general election of 2024.
Wow.
And the purpose of the disclosure of the Halderman report is for everybody to see what's going on in Georgia, and the voters of Georgia to say to their governor and secretary of state, would you please install these patches so that we can have a slightly more secure election this year?
All these machines can have these vulnerabilities, could they not?
Right. It's not just the Dominion machines in Georgia. Right. They're all computers. Right. They all have vulnerabilities. The ones that have known vulnerabilities are the ones that some judge has let some security expert investigate.
Right.
And the ones you're using in Arkansas are just ones where no judge has recently let anyone investigate, but I'm sure they have all the same flaws.
Right. Well, listen, I want to thank you so much, sir, for coming on our program and sharing with our audience your expertise, your decades of study in this particular field. It's just amazing. And I hope that you come back. I'd love for you to come back later on at your convenience sometime and talk more in depth. But for right now, we're out of time. But I wanted to thank you so much for coming to our show. And we respect the heck out of you. Come to Arkansas. We hope we get you here.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be on your show.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And thank you for being with the Kernel of Truth. And we'll come back next week. Thanks so much.